you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not the first time, actually, that I talk at one of the events of the Academy of Cultural Diplomacy. Some years ago, probably 6, 7 years ago, so I had the pleasure of being here in a different venue. You will see very soon that I'm going to move, and I'm wondering how this camera is probably not moving with me. And since this session is recorded, I try to stay as close to the microphone, but do not expect me to stand here all the time. I hope still that the recording can go on, even so I move a little bit. Because before I make my general sort of introduction into the topic of legitimacy or authority of global governance or governing in a global world, I need to know a little bit of your background in terms of human rights. It's a human rights conference. So either you had all a very thorough introduction before you came here on the international global human rights regime, or you had a very brief crash course when you arrived yesterday or today. But just to get an idea, because the whole thing that I'm going to present to you are very current or recent developments in the global human rights regime and the consequence it has for governance and also for governments. But in order to present this and so it can make sense to you, I need to know what you know about human rights. So this is going to be my part of learning from you now. So I just want to get an idea from you when you think about human rights or human rights regime. I don't know how many people have heard about the human rights regime. Some probably studied it or coming in from international organizations, etc. What comes to your mind? Again, otherwise this makes no sense if you don't clarify that. Any idea? Human rights regimes or human rights? Yeah. Absolutely. Do you have any ideas? Can you mention, let's say, a few social economic rights and individual political rights, the ones that come to your mind? All right. Okay, well, give me an idea where you're standing. Mm-hmm.
I work for an organization in New York, and so the things that we look for, what I fundraise for, were equal marriage practices. That's how general equal rights for people that are LGBT, or and
Right. Because these human rights that you just described, or same-sex marriage, etc., are based on non-discrimination, based on gender, sexual orientation. If we do not have an international treaty or convention that specifically focuses on that group, like it is sort of hidden in other conventions and treaties there. Right. Okay. We often distinguish between fundamental freedom rights, which are usually sort of political rights, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, etc. And then what you were just highlighting on the whole thing of the right to clean water, clean water, or right to housing, the right to education, etc. These are social or economic rights. Yeah? The right to work would be a economic right. There are various branches of human rights. And they are often, it depends really from where you're going. Some people would say they are not really fundamental freedom rights, they are human rights. Yeah? If the whole term, sort of the whole spectrum is human rights, and then within the human rights, we take the fundamental freedom rights out, because we say, well, we, the human rights community, says you cannot claim the right to education, the right to adequate housing, for if you do not have freedom of you can wish to have access to clean water, but if you are not allowed to express this wish or the need, as you were saying, the human rights is sort of just no matter comes out and it's basically use it. By the way, this is a dispute that probably you encounter less nowadays, but 20 years ago that was the main topic. We had sessions and groups like this just on what comes first, fundamental freedom rights or social economic rights. Because the Cold War kind of gave us a legacy of separating the two, and now after 20, 25 years they're all coming together again. You cannot express freely your opinion or have the right to information or access to information if you're starving. On the other side, if you are suffering hunger or starvation, these basic needs, you need to be free with rights. So they are very different. Please. Yeah.
Okay. My name is Anja, and I would just like to say something. For example, especially in Germany itself, when it was talking about the LGBT community and stuff like that. So I was working for my country there for around 6 months, and I was working for Christian Democratic Party, which is CDU itself. So those are already so against about the same-sex marriages and all. So, but few of the members, they were like so much against about it, and but few of the members, so we were actually fighting for. They were fighting for like about 10 years or so. So just overnight, and the chancellor and the market would make a statement on the next day. It was released that okay, it can be possible, and everything will change overnight. So I mean, it's really an issue, of course.
This is the case is interesting, not only in Germany, everywhere around Europe, in kind of same-sex marriage and the LGBT rights. There are various rights kind of sometimes, well, I don't want to use the term contradictory, and competing, and you constantly have to negotiate. For instance, you have no rule have human rights to confidentiality. Marriage is a human right, you know that, and found a family. And that is why in a lot of social contexts of political discourse, you say, well, same-sex marriage, all right, is it now a family funding right, if there's no family involved merging, or is it just, sort of a partnership, let it go? And therefore you have a lot of disputes even on that level about is it actually a human right, or is it just something you let go, or, because family is a human right.
Yeah, that was about it. Like they were agreed if a single LGBT person or gay person were able to adopt the children. But when you are a partner or married, then it is not possible. So that would be all being involved. So
we're right into the debate. It's a very good example. We can have a million other examples when it comes to access to clean water, whether drinking water should be free or should be just accessible in terms of being affordable financially. We have all these disputes on a daily basis. Or if the right to work means that you should have, the government should give you work, just like this. Or the right to education means that you should have free education until you are 35, or just the first 4 years. There you can see. Right? There you can see just to have this very abstract term of human rights, the right to education or work or housing. It's the same with it's adequate housing. Does it mean a shelter will be enough, or should the government give you a proper room apartment for free, of course? Yeah. So they're very different perception when it comes to human rights. The same with freedom of expression and freedom of information. I'm sure you have all made use of it today. I see people are already looking at their smartphones, and you're actually using your human rights from expressing, posting on Facebook or wherever, and getting information by looking at who has emailed you or what's the latest news about the non-existing coalition in Germany. So, that was really very briefly, but just so it gave me a sense to where you are standing, and let's see how we can improvise here. The legitimacy in the local world and from a human rights perspective. I'm not making this up. What I'm presenting to you, these are observations and sort of summaries of recent developments and debates in the human rights community. Basically, the general assumption is that since we have the human rights regime and the human rights norms, it started in 1948 more or less, so we have 70 or more than 70 years already in the game, that we have seen over the last decades kind of, some would say, a marathon of creating international human rights treaties. A treaty against racism and discrimination, a treaty in international, when I say treaty, international treaties, I mean mainly UN treaties. I could also do this for the European context, but since most people here come from around the world, I just stick with the UN and make it a bit easier. So we have the anti-discrimination, anti-racism treaty. We have political and civil rights treaties, a covenant. We have social economic rights, covenant/treaty. We have a treaty that defines the rights of the child, the rights of women, or to abolish discrimination against women. We have an international convention on the rights of people with disability, and so on. We have, to give you an estimate, worldwide, several hundreds of international treaties that define your and my human rights. Often they kick out of the general human rights that I was just mentioning to you, whether it's the freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to housing, or the right to work, and then they specified in various treaties. Why am I saying this? We had this kind of marathon going on over the past decades in defining and being always more specific, solving the last question of what the right to food actually means and does not mean. A little bit from what I say, education, what does the right to education mean? Does it mean you have free education until you die, or it doesn't mean elementary education? By the way, the secret solution is that there's a general agreement around the world, a global agreement that says yes, 4 years minimum. In this country, it's 10 years or 12 years minimum of free education. In other countries 4 years, because you can also see some countries say we cannot afford free education until people are 25 years old. It's just too expensive, but we have to, at least we can afford 4 years. That really depends on the economic situation, but also, I would say, on the political world. Why am I saying this? We have around 2005, so in the last 10 years, we see worldwide something that we would call a norm saturation. Because one thing is that you have human rights on the paper. That's what we find in the treaties. I just throw in some terminology. We do not have time to go through this in depth, but it's what they call the UN treaty database. There you find all the international conventions. You find this also on the African Union level. You find it at the inter-American state level, and of course on the European level they have separate and additional treaties on human rights. Why human rights saturation, norm saturation? Basically what they say around 2005, there's a reason for it. You can always say it comes alongside with the establishment of the UN Human Rights Council. We did not have a Human Rights Council before 2005. You all know a Security Council from the UN, but we did not know about the Human Rights Council. It did not exist before. We have it since 2005, and then after 2005, we hardly have any new global treaty. That's why they call norm saturation. Basically, we have discussed the last 2 decades or 2 generations about what could be the right of the child and the individual rights, and we have discussed it now. Now it's the time, and that's what they generally say, the time of implementation. So we're living in a decade of implementing what we have discussed the last 2 generations. That's your decade, or not my decade, of course. And this is also the decade where you have talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, the responsibility to protect, and many, many others. And I think you will come to this in the next days too. So these norm saturation, where they say, look, we have discussed enough, we have put it on the paper, now let's see how we implement it. That comes along with another phenomenon also initiated by the United Nations, what they call the Human Rights Education Decades and Phases and Developments. And the reason why you are sitting is actually a result of it. You came here because of this human rights issue, you wanted to learn more, but it intrigued you. A conference like this, 20, 25 years ago, there would be 5 people sitting here. You would say, human rights? What's that? Never heard of it. You're right, I don't know idea. So the awareness, the general awareness of human rights has spread around the globe, and that's actually what we're sitting here. So what does it mean? The observations that we find is that this human rights norm saturation, the norm construct has changed your and my awareness and perception of who is responsible to actually guarantee me the right of adequate housing or my access to clean water. If I would have asked you 20, 30 years ago, some of you were probably not born then, but if I would have asked you a decade ago or 2 decades ago, you would have immediately said, of course, it's the state. Of course, the government owes me. I'm the taxpayer, so the government owes me. And if the government violates my freedom of expression, it will censor my Facebook account. They close it, grammar. Or if they do not provide access to clean drinking water, and at the same time cheap clean water, then you have a revolution. Yeah? And whom do you make responsible? Of course, the state. And that has shifted dramatically over the past decade. And so it has what we call legitimacy of global governance, Why? Because we have seen in the same time the development of human rights, and there's a term says human rights are the rights of you and me, not of the state, right? The state has just in the first decades kind of been the guarantor of, all right, we signed it, we ratified it, but it's actually you and we who have to implement it on a daily basis. It's your and my rights, we are responsible for it. And that's something that a lot of people say, that's uncomfortable. It's great to have entitlements and rights, but the others should be responsible for it. I'm not. Yeah? And that is actually not the deal with human rights. Kind of the state, or governments in the ideal sense. I know in the reality we are far away from that, so don't get me wrong, but the time we have, I just create the ideal scenario now. The ideal scenario is, of course, since we were given human rights in the first step by the states, there is also a certain obligation and responsibility. And that has changed our perception, but also when we, for instance, when you claim your human rights to a healthy environment, by the way, it's your human rights, huh? Your human rights to health is connected to a healthy environment in times of climate change and pollution is a big issue. Who do you go to in your country? If the river that passes alongside your house is polluted, who do you go to? What's the first, what do you call first?
I'm from the United States, so if there's any type of pollution or any kind of issue, you go to the EPA.
What is that?
The Environmental Protection Agency.
Yeah, okay.
So usually have a reference or a contact in that, or you would have to, they didn't take your case, you would have to go to an NGO or a grassroots organization.
All right, 2 of them, you need 1 more. There are 3 that you will call, but you're
also your local politician.
You will? Okay, there's 1 more that you will call. No, who's polluting the river?
The company.
Hey, yeah.
The company usually doesn't.
Oh, very low level of trust here. Yeah, okay, but perfect. That's exactly the game we are in. That we have various, let's say, authorities / institutions, or in that even private actors that are responsible. Okay, maybe the government, and you're absolutely right, you have an agency, you call them, or a policy maker. They are, of course, responsible for setting the guidelines, the rules, the regulation of not, polluting the river or the lake or whatever. But it's also the company that does it. And as you say, civil society organization is also part of the game in terms of guaranteeing your and my human rights to the environment. Please. You're right into the debate. Yeah, right. Oh, you're catching up very quick. You're just very much up to what the big challenges are. That's what they say, the human rights regime, kind of a little bit the monster you created, yeah? Is now kind of confronting all of us. We have created this international human rights regime. By the way, regime is a positive term, or a neutral positive term in that sense here. A lot of people are sometimes confused when they hear a regime. They think, oh, it's a regime. No, regime is a very neutral term. It means that there are regime is usually set up by a mandate, like a political regime has a constitution, has a parliament, etc., etc., electorate. And so does the human rights regime or the climate change regime, the trade regime. They are all regimes. Yeah? They regulate trade, global climate change. And so is human rights. It's an official term, just in case you hear it again in the next days. It's an official term. Human rights regime have shifted regimes. By the way, we have regional regimes around the world, various ones, have shifted the responsibilities from a state-centric approach. 20 years ago, you would have called only one, the state authorities, to an individual or private one. So it's actually, the responsibilities. These who are responsible to make the environment, let's say, healthy, so you and I, we can enjoy our personal development and our personal human rights, has shifted. Let's see. All right. I just jumped this because I see this the time. Oh, yeah, I was playing around, and I want to show you a little film actually, and it also shows you. It's only a minute and a half. It also shows you where the debate, the challenge is, and when I say this now. Bear with me, there is not a solution yet how we are going to divide the share of responsibility for you and for us, and who is taking the final kind of decision in terms of guaranteeing your freedom of expression or access to information. Just let's see.
How can we work towards shared responsibility? Imagine a construction worker is building a roof, but then it falls down. And the house collapses. Who's to blame? Well, the builder, of course. But what if you knew someone delivered the wrong stones? Or made a wrong sketch? Or just stood there watching the errors pile up? Who's to blame now? But what if these builders were states, international organizations, and corporations? And the collapsed house represents bigger, collective problems such as climate change, armed conflict, and the protection of refugees. When something goes wrong here, it's even more difficult to identify who is responsible, and blame shifting takes place. The SHARE project tries to identify how responsibility should be shared under international law, and how we can work towards shared responsibility.
So very short, but let me see what you think about that. Just a brief introduction to the SHARE project. It is located at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, but it's a European Union funded global project of lawyers, of historians, anthropologists, policymakers that actually work on the problem that you have just seen and we have just discussed. That because of the rise of international human rights law that is based on these human rights norms that we have just discussed, the responsibilities as they were once have gone. Your and my reality today is no longer that I can blame the state, and the state is not always responsible for everything. However, we do not know, and it's exactly what you were saying also, if something happens or something now, there's a natural disaster that leads thousands or millions of people to leave the country, and that was issued by climate change. How much responsibility do you and I have? These people that seek refuge. We are going on, all of you have been on planes before, I suppose. Been sitting in car. So we all have a slice of responsibility. Maybe the responsibility is like this. And you and I, we have a 50-cent responsibility out of the $1 million responsibility. And that changes our awareness and the legitimacy. Legitimacy is connected to authority, who takes decision, who can make a difference. And the major issues that will drive this kind of change of awareness, but also the search for new legitimacy and decision making. Let's see, I will just this should be it. Is of course climate change. That's one of the main drivers here. Because I say in terms of climate change, you've also seen this in the short video clip. Climate change is very difficult. We know we are all somewhat responsible just by the fact that we consume, and sometimes we have no other, we have no real alternative. We consume products that have been shipped around the world and contributed to climate change. So what can we do, yeah? With those that we are wearing, etc., with laptop here. So anyway, but the point is not so much to reverse it and go back to Stone Age, but rather on how that if we take more ownership and responsibility of it, that's probably the best way to prevent to become it worse. And that has to do with the human rights awareness and this whole notion of human rights, that it's not the state, it's you and me, that are responsible for a healthy environment.
I have a question about this. The notion of climate justice,
Yeah.
do you see that as a norm, or do you see it as a way of raising awareness of it? I don't want to change personal behavior as a way to address it.
Right. A very good point, because there is the notion of climate justice coming from climate change and the human rights. Mary Robinson curved the term climate justice, and actually what they did, and I would say yes, it has become a norm already, because in order to say it's not about returning the planet to what it was 200 years ago. There is no way to do it, but it's a little bit about this shared responsibility to say, all right, if because of climate change certain people, and not only polar bears, but people have to emigrate in masses. We see this now in Australia and in New Zealand, where from the small Pacific islands like the Fiji Islands or Vanuatu, people are coming, seek refuge, and as you know, refugees normally should go back to their countries once there is peace and happiness. Well, these countries no longer exist because they're underwater. So what does it mean for citizenship, for justice in terms of, their human rights to citizenship? For instance, just as one example, there are hundreds of examples. This is why the climate justice term has become sort of a norm. It's like, how are we going to deal with it? Because as you know, when you migrate in the past, or you seek refuge and you wanted to stay in this particular country where you seek refuge, you sooner or later maybe became citizenship or a citizen, or your children became, or whatever. But these people now from Vanuatu, or from the small Pacific islands, when they come and seek refuge in New Zealand, they say, no, I'm not giving them my citizenship. There was no war, there was nothing. My government was a lovely government. Why should I change my citizenship? The country no longer exists. So you have a global responsibility. And New Zealand and Australia, they already passed some interesting judgments on this. Whoever wants to. I'm not telling you the outcome. I hope I intrigue you to look at this. You're trying to solve, and it's exactly about this shared responsibility. Well, they can keep their citizenship, that is as much as I can tell you. But the question is whether they get citizenship rights in New Zealand. Because you can, of course, you have your citizenship, but when you go abroad, you don't have the same citizen rights as people in that country. That's a dilemma. And this all contributes to the debate. Some people say, citizenship was yesterday anyway, we get a global citizenship, blah, blah, blah. So there is another major challenge. That's the one some of you are probably doing right now. If they get bored by this presentation, looking at your smartphone, or checking your emails or latest news, interesting, it's cyber internet governance. That is probably, I would personally say this is even a bigger dimension than even climate change. For climate change, more or less the space it covers, the globe, the planet. But this space, cyberspace, I sometimes compare it with, just imagine you would look like a space, a territory that has not been, some would say colonialized, others would say civilized, depending on your view. And it has 4 billion inhabitants. That's the latest figure. About 8 billion people on the planet who will only kind of stop growing about 11 billion in a generation or so. And that means half of them have access to internet every day. So you have just imagine you go to a country where there is no police, no constitution, no parliament, no police, no court, no nothing. 4 billion citizens. China and India and a little bit more of Southeast Asia together. No governance. There's a little regional governance patches here and there, you know, so it's self-governance. Then you see the challenge. And the only guiding norm, these 4 billion people on this new planet, let's say, are human rights. And that's what internet governance is about. It's like, what kind of norms to regulate the internet, to save your and my human rights, privacy in the internet is the only guideline we have human rights, because that is a general agreement among these 4 billion people. So that's another dimension that attributes to this whole idea of legitimacy, that, and we know there is no nation state, and the nation state will not solve it and will not protect your and my privacy in the cyberspace. This is absolutely without going. We need, of course, Google and Microsoft and all these big players in the game, but we also need the users, you and me. So here we see already we have, of course, the nation state is still somewhere there. It's not out of the race. International global regimes, the site for governance regime is, or internet governance is an international regime, and you and me as the local individual people are the players. The same is for migration, because I don't have time, I'm not going much into it, but the migration also erodes the existing nation state and the concept of human rights, citizenship rights in particular. Another point, the fourth kind of challenge element that kind of erodes our traditional concept of nation state, and the government as being the guarantor of human rights, is the mobility and globalization. It connects a little bit to migration. I suppose, if I would ask around, most of you have a migration background. We all have. We assume nowadays that currently the 8 billion people, a fourth of them at least has a direct migration background. That means one family member or grandparent member comes from some other part than where you have your residency. Not meaning not being tourists in Germany, but being residents or the citizens of the country. So this has completely changed from all the centuries before. In the centuries before, when you migrated or you had, you were mobile, let's say, you migrated to one spot, and you stayed there. You did not constantly return. I see this nowadays with my students. They study in various countries, and then they work a number of years in France and a number of years in Canada, etc., and they pay taxes all around the world. But the tax system and the retirement system is not adapted towards new migrants, and that will also erode the nation state's responsibility. So you see there's from all levels. Just to keep that. And then I stop with this one. What is global legitimacy or global governance? What is meant by it? I kind of try to highlight it that we have this, and that is new because, again, 30, 40 years ago, anybody talking about human rights and human rights regime, they would be saying the nation state, the government, they go to an international forum, the United Nations, for example, they agree on certain norms, they go back home and they try to implement them for their citizens. They don't care what their neighboring country is doing with them. Non-interference and all these rules and regulations. Today we have 3 players in the game. One player is you and me. The civil society or local authorities, that's also with decentralization, federalization, but also when you even look in countries which are very state-centric still, you already see that there is sort of a dispersion and a distribution of power to local authorities, because that has to do with conflicts and how conflicts arise. If you give them autonomy and authority, they're less likely local or territories will rebel against you. That's another, we don't have time to go into this, but it is a tendency that you can see all around the world. You will probably immediately say, so what about all this nationalism right now and populism that tries to concentrate the power in the center? That is a counter movement. But we already see the majority of let's say, not only world societies, but countries, we see actually this tendency. So that means you have the national governments and representations still in the center of the game. This is now an ideal feature, of course, but it disperses power or shares power to both the local authorities or to international organizations. In Europe, those of you who are familiar with the European Union is the only, there is no other organization in the world that is supranational. That means, you probably are more familiar with international or regional organizations. In Europe, if you're from Africa, you know the African Union. If you're from Latin America, the Inter-American Organization. And in Europe, we have various ones. One of them is a supranational, the European Union. That means it has outside a state power. It can overrule certain member states if they don't agree. If you have on the UN level, you more or less have to be always in consensus about something. The African Union and the International Organization. So the majority are international, interstate, supra-state. And they have influence because they set norms. But these norms, of course, are lobbied, and that's coming back to your environmental example. Again, 40 years ago, if you wanted to change some sort of international human rights norm, even it was the government, you lobbied your government in order to go on the UN level, for instance, the Children Convention, the rights of the child. You will hear more about this, I think, the next day. That was, of course, it was governments who tabled that idea of this convention, and they were lobbied back home from children organizations, the organization on behalf of children, to have this convention. Nowadays, you and I, we can go directly to the UN and lobby. For instance, the Disability Convention was a direct lobbying result from organizations that represented people with disabilities. Also, still governments were involved, that's how it's set up, but that's a novelty, and that's the area you live in. Therefore, of course, and now this is my last sentence, the idea of this global governance and legitimacy, shifting legitimacy, let's say, is based on the fact that, all right, we are coming from this very comfortable kind of behavior. We lobby, we protest, and then if the government doesn't do what we want, we criticize the government. Very comfortable. We're always right. We're always right, the other ones are wrong. And that in the government's kind of the organization say, that was yesterday. If you want to sit in the room, if you want to be part of the game of setting norms, human rights norms, defining them, etc., when you leave the room, you also take your share of responsibility, even if it's 0.11%. And this is where we are right now, and this is why the European Union is sponsoring this very big shares program to say, look, how can we, in terms of legal terms, not only in political terms, in legal terms, how can we actually separate the responsibilities? I leave it there because the time is over. I got clear indications. However, do you have some time for discussion? Thank you.